Hey folks, glad you're with us. I'm Mark Serrano. This is Off Leash with my friend and colleague Erik Prince. Erik, how we doing?
Good, thanks. How are you, Mark?
Awesome. This is great. Another episode. Here's what I want to do today. So I think neocons are basically driving us towards another world war. And what I want to do is, for everybody's benefit, let's start with sort of defining what is a neocon.
Back in the 60s, when the Democrat Party split to a extremely far pacifist left, the neocons kind of jumped towards a interventionist leftist approach. And I would say that that paradigm has compounded itself over the years to a ridiculous state now, and especially in the 90s, 2000s, and to the present, where it is a statist, big government, interventionist approach to all foreign policy. And they're the ones that wanted to go hard after Russia, even after the end of the Cold War, that's been pushing to expand NATO, that's, to expanding NATO's borders right up into the Russia border. After there was commitments made in the 90s, we will not expand NATO at all.
Right.
They were the ones that promised to Ukraine that they would join NATO and all these things. And so they are the ones that gave us the Iraq War and the debacle of the pullout. And so this same set of foreign policy so-called experts have made bad call after bad call after bad call, and no one's ever called bullshit on them to say, what are you doing? What are you doing with our sons and daughters? Because the biggest issue is they are the ones sending someone else's sons and daughters to go do the fighting and the dying, and the ones that are ignoring the plight of tens of thousands of our veterans sitting at home having been damaged by wars that really didn't have much of a desired outcome for America.
Right.
And so now they're, after wanting to make Ukraine a NATO ally or whatever. Look, bad on Russia for invading Ukraine. Bad, dumb, wrong, evil.
Opportunism.
But they were the neocons have been very unnecessarily provocative, backed by the military-industrial complex, which is always happy to sell more overpriced weapons. And so the debacle that is Ukraine is compounding, and again, the Republicans with the power of the purse can be the adults and pull us back from the edge. NATO has proven itself to be quite useless. Feckless. Still only 5 of the 28 countries even spend 2% of their GDP on defense. So the neocons are leading us down a disaster, just like they did in Iraq, just like they never even figured out how to govern or build real capacity in Afghanistan. I mean, they were the ones that were promising to Biden the Afghan government will hold for at least 6 months to a year.
Right.
And it lasted,
Outrageous.
a couple of weeks.
So
and again, no one is ever called to account, because the same if the elite universities that are producing all these neocons with all their wonderful graduate degrees from Harvard and Yale and wherever, if that's the best America's doing, then it's probably time to go back and recruit from the community colleges for our national security leadership.
Damn
because the elite universities are failing miserably.
Funny you say that, because Ivy League, this is according to Politico, Ivy League grads have a 20% better chance of being hired and earning promotions in the foreign service from the Ivy Leagues, 20% better chance than from another university, right? That's exactly, you're saying it's this ideological pipeline coming from the elite, universities, the Ivy Leagues, into our foreign service with this far leftist outlook and ideology.
July 4, 2021, the summer that Afghanistan collapsed, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul felt it important enough to put their LGBTQ flag, all that in their announcement. That was the most important thing to them, not the fact that the Afghan army was getting rolled up and that the country was heading towards absolute disaster. it's a completely, it's a mental detachment. It's a mental disease of how separated from reality these people are.
So a guy named Stephen Walt, professor of international affairs at Harvard, has written extensively about how foreign policy elitism has become a self-reinforcing system, in his words. With the price of entry into the foreign policy establishment being the ability to convince the existing elites that you agree with their worldview. So it's groupthink. It's complete groupthink, right? And the irony is neocon comes from neoconservatives, but it's not just political conservatives.
It has nothing to do.
It used to be the anti-war left.
It has nothing to do with conservatives or anything remotely conservative or small or limited government at all. It is the most expansionist, big state, big spending, big government, clumsy, stupid approach that America has done. Look, America does not understand how to be an effective partner in building capacity in all these other countries, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or the Sahel or Somalia. We go to these places and we have half-assed activities which never actually finish the insurgency or build capacity. And it is such a rejection of anything that's worked historically in the past. And it's the hubris of believing that if I just have more government money and more government time, that we're going to solve this. And so we've spent trillions of dollars. No American that can fog a mirror can look at Iraq or Afghanistan and say, "Great job, guys. Let's do that again."
But no one,
none of the intellectual architects, none of the generals, none of the so-called smart people that are put in positions of responsibility have been held to account. And that goes for Bush administration people, Obama, Trump administration, even Biden administration.
And what does that look like?
Because even Trump, mistake, he did not fully control his national security apparatus.
No, not at all.
And they were of the same paradigm, which is why he was constantly bucking heads with them. They never had a small government approach to foreign policy.
Well, these were globalists that came into the populist White House, and so they were let in the front door.
Like a turd in a punch bowl.
Unfortunately, he was snookered into believing that they would follow through with his agenda, and they were actually working against it.
Yes, and I hope Trump wins, but he's got to get. I mean, personnel is policy, and he's got to get that right.
Well, I think he's learned his lesson. Certainly, based on the outcome from last time, I think there's no doubt that he has to take a different course with that. But staying on neocons for a second. So this is groupthink in Washington, and we've completely sort of destabilized regions now. I mean, based on the Afghan withdrawal, clearly that neocon philosophy has prompted devastating results in the world, right?
For all the concern about women's rights and human rights in Afghanistan, they have turned the page and ignored it. And for all the posturing and all the stuff that they thought was important, it got fed to them by, at the end of a bayonet. Look at what the neocons did in Libya. Gaddafi might not have been great, but he at least kept order in the place.
Kept order.
And they knock him over in 2011. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of weapons leak into the entire Sahel. And now you have 8 coups in the last 3 years in the Sahel from this instability and the jihadi explosion that's caused by that.
Right, and
it's the law of unintended consequences, and they do lots of stupid shit.
Yeah, the globalist, the neocon Hillary Clinton was scoffing about taking out Gaddafi, right? And him being dragged through the street and basically hung in effigy, his remains. I mean, she was scoffing at it, right? She was proud of it. She thought, "This is hysterical. We just took out Gaddafi."
And the country's been a disaster ever since, and millions of people suffering unnecessarily.
But it's this neocon approach.
It's this interventionist approach that if they think big U.S. government can recreate and order things the way that they dream it up in the classrooms of Harvard and Yale.
So 2 more things on this. How would we hold accountability? What does that look like? If you're running an administration, what does that look like?
Look, it's pretty simple to see what success or what failures people have had, and it's perfectly acceptable to fire people, pull their clearances, and tell them to go find another career field.
Right.
Enough of this. Enough. Here's the thing. We have an all-volunteer military that has a massive, massive recruiting problem now because of the way our political leaders have sent them into battle, waged war in half measures, and then pulled out. And for all the blood and sacrifice that these guys gave, their lives, their limbs, their mental health, their marriages, to have it pissed away by politicians, the guys and men and women, the veterans, have a right to be angry. And it causes a lot of people to not want to join the military if they're getting fed a bunch of woke nonsense, led by people that are towing the neocon line of we're gonna
Sure.
waste your efforts, we're gonna waste the best years of your life doing half-assed police actions and preventing you from winning.
Diversity, equity, inclusion. That does not
That
lead
does not
to
win battles.
preparedness. Right?
Does not, preparedness or does not win battles. We haven't had a great track record of finishing fights in America for decades now.
Last thing on this, the industrial military complex. How are they fueling this neocon fervor, this interventionist fervor today?
Sure. Money. They get appropriated a ridiculous amount of money. There's been a massive over-consolidation. Again, there's a whole nother segment we're going to do on over-consolidation of American industry.
Mm-hmm.
But you've gone from 100 major defense contractors down to 5. Okay? And those 5...
In how much time? Over what period of time?
Over the last 20 years.
40, yep.
And those 5 charge massively too much from the taxpayers for weapon systems that largely don't work that well in the kind of environments that they have to face today. And so whether it's Boeing spending a whole lot of money on the Kennedy Center and in this fellowship, or they sprinkle money around hundreds and hundreds of lobbyists, effectively a battalion of lobbyists between all those defense contractors, passing money to Congress, passing money to associations and fellowships for Pentagon bureaucrats. So they reinforce the same groupthink of half measures and political correctness in how we wage wars. And it's the antithesis of a winning, efficient, credible alternative.
And by the way, there's no checks and balances here because we don't declare war anymore. We just go to war.
We don't declare war. Congress has done a terrible job of accountability for funds.
Yep.
And again, the lobbyists working for the Lockheed, Northrop, Boeings sprinkle a lot of money, especially to the appropriators in Congress, which keeps the money flowing. I mean, just now the Navy is retiring dozens of ships, the littoral combat ships, which earned the name Little Crappy Ships, 15 up to 20 years earlier than they're supposed to. Some of those ships are only 10 years old, and the Navy's retiring them because they're so ineffective at what they're doing. And that was a multi-$100 billion ship program, which doesn't fail. There is a litany of those fails. So again, the neocons with the buddies in the military-industrial complex, over-consolidated, way overrepresented in with money in Washington,
right,
is a very, very unhealthy thing. And the people that are going to suffer are our sons and daughters serving in the military if these idiots get us into a war in Europe or in Asia because we focused more on diversity and inclusion instead of actually on deterrence and being ready.
And fraud, waste.
The foreign policy of the United States should be that our friends love us, our rivals respect us, and our enemies fear us. And we don't have any of those anymore. Of that. Exactly.
Well,
and the Gulf, the Saudis, the Emiratis are pissed. Why? Because they thought they had a friendship, a partnership in the United States that we would back them up. And then the Iranians via the Houthis launch attack drones and cruise missiles against their airports and oil infrastructure, and the U.S. does nothing.
They had that partnership from us 3 years ago.
Sure they did. What does the Biden administration do? They paid $5 billion for some hostages to the Iranians. So again and again and again, we severely disappoint our friends, our so-called allies. I mean, Rahm Emanuel, the super leftist U.S. ambassador to Japan, instead of letting Japan focus on preparing and reforming militarily to deter China, Rahm Emanuel is jamming down all kinds of LGBTQ whatever nonsense on Japan.
To a very conservative society.
A very conservative society.
Right.
And they're angry about it.
Right.
And they're saying, wait a minute, America, do you want us to focus on China, or do you want to focus on sexual deviancy?
It's the latter. Absolutely. So we're going to get into how the neocons, the interventionists, actually are trying to get us into war with Russia. We're going to come back and talk about that in a minute.
Imagine a technology company built to restore your privacy, not take it away. You and your phone are constantly bombarded with tracking, surveillance, propaganda, and digital attacks. Even big tech companies claiming to protect privacy create their own backdoors. Unplugged restores what's been lost, starting with a messenger, a VPN, a mobile antivirus. The Unplugged app bundle gives you back what's rightfully yours. Unplugged. Restore your privacy.
Hey folks, we are off leash with Erik Prince, Mark Serrano. All right, Erik, we just had a great conversation about the neocons, the interventionists. Maybe never a better example of being sort of pushed towards war for the U.S. in a direct hot conflict than with the Russia-Ukraine.
Into a hot conflict with an opponent that has lots of nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
Zeroed on Washington and all our key cities.
Right. So, first of all, as of July 31, supposedly, I don't even believe this number, we have sent $76.8 billion to Ukraine. It's got to be well north. It's probably double that.
I'm thinking it's 2x that.
It's right.
Easily.
Exactly.
Especially, they can undervalue the replacement costs of a lot of the inventory that's been sent there out of Pentagon
So that's
stocks.
how they hide the numbers.
Sure.
All right. And then, so total military related aid, supposedly 46.6 billion. Again, got to be 2.x that. And 28 billion was for weapons and equipment. 2x that, 3x that, right?
Higher.
Way up, much higher. In comparison, we left what, $78 billion worth of equipment in Afghanistan? We have sold way past that number in Ukraine. And by the way, with no accounting, no accountability, no audit.
No inspector general assigned.
Right.
And just 10 days ago, before Zelensky came to New York, fired every deputy defense minister for corruption. So
how do you maintain armed forces when you do that?
Look,
it's who they are, right? It's their nature.
They've always had corruption issues. The odd thing is, someone needs to do a detailed study of how much Russian gas has continued to flow through Ukraine even during the war. How much of an enemy can they be if you're still selling their gas? Which of those oligarchs is still making money, or is Zelensky making money on that deal? Or is there a Democrat super donor that's making money on that deal?
Yeah.
So that whole thing stinks. You can't tell me it's that much of an existential threat and fight for existence if you still have Russian gas flowing across.
How the hell does that work?
pipes.
How the hell does Zelensky allow for gas to be transported?
That's a good question. I don't know if that's a backroom deal to assuage some of the other European so-called NATO allies or not, but it is not ultimately America's fight. It is wrong that the Russians invaded, that they gnawed off that territory. But again, the neocons made a lot of moves, unnecessarily provocative. I actually provided a document in December of 20, okay, 3 months before the invasion, because I was then confident that the Russians are going to invade. It was not a false flag, because I saw them canceling some actual weapons orders from leaving Russia. So that if they have real financial penalties, then it's not, they're not kidding. And at that point, the U.S. had announced that they were retiring 200 combat aircraft, F-15s, F-16, some A-10s. They were going to be flown during 2021 to the desert out in Arizona, Davis-Monthan, the Boneyard, and parked. It was written off for all eternity. I said, fine, do a lend-lease, make an announcement. Ukraine will not be part of NATO ever.
Right.
but they're going to have the means to defend themselves.
Same difference,
Yes,
effectively.
fine. But again, that would have been a $250 million option. Aircraft that are already written off to zero, $100 million for labor costs, for contract maintenance and contract pilots, $150 million in weapons, old weapons that you could send, and use F-15s, F-16s, A-10s, disperse them in Ukraine, and they would have had the means. Even if you had to use contractor pilots, fine. That would have stopped and deterred any invasion. But again, the invasion comes, and it has been bleeding Ukrainian society. And now, I mean, they've lost hundreds of thousands of men and women and civilians.
Right?
The most able-bodied, most capable, best fighters in Ukraine are now all largely
gone.
dead. And that's going to have a multi-generational effect on their society, because you're taking out the best part of their gene pool has now been killed by Russian artillery. And the real mistake is that Ukrainian generals, through the promotion and thinking of the West, has basically tried to out-conventional war a much bigger Russian army, which, granted, isn't perfect, but they're pretty good at conventional war yet, even if they take a lot of casualties doing it. And with this massive summer offensive that had all this promise, using Western tanks, Leopards, and Chieftain tanks from Europe, and it's just they just basically drove into a big rototiller.
So this is nuts. Let's talk about the summer offensive, right? This vaunted summer offensive. Lay it out for me. What were we supposed to see happen?
The key thing is to cut off the Russians' ability to supply Crimea, because the Ukrainians really want to retake Crimea.
Right.
And you've heard a lot about the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is this little bridge right there where the purple dotted line is.
Yep.
That connects Crimea to the mainland of Russia. So you're supposed to see maneuver warfare, basically combined arms, like you would see the U.S. Army did in Iraq in 2003, but nowhere near the capability or the skill to do that, especially, right? It's one thing fighting against the Iraqi army. It's another thing fighting against the Russian army in a very, very complex electronic warfare environment. Okay, I would argue that even U.S. units that were dropped in to do that would have real trouble fighting against the Russians the way they are. Why? Because the Russians jam all the communications. So you put in your armor units or your mechanized cavalry units, and now they can't communicate with each other. They can't see where each other are. They can't call for fire. They can't coordinate. They have to drive through minefields. Okay, the Battle of Kursk, which happened 80 years ago this summer, was the largest tank battle in military history.
Right.
6,000 tanks, Nazi Germany versus the Soviet Union. And that happened just north of Ukraine, but very much the same flat terrain.
Right.
And there was a bulge in the Russian line around the city of Kursk. And the Germans were trying to do a pincer movement to attack from the north and the south.
Right.
And because of the Enigma code being broken,
Mm-hmm.
Brits were aware of it,
Right.
leaked it to the Russians. So the Russians knew when, where, and how many Germans were going to be attacking, and the Russians went crazy on building multi-layered defenses. The same kind of
And so that's
conventional
the same
defenses
thing we see.
you see now. And the Russian generals are not idiots. They know what the lines of attack the Ukrainians are going to take, because you can't do it across the swamp. You're going to avoid rivers, so it narrows your lanes of approach. And they have built layer upon layer of minefields, dragon's teeth, all the other stuff, with overlaid with lots of artillery fire, and artillery fire that's adjusted with their own drones. And then now you've added in the other fact of these, it's called a Lancet. It's a suicide, a kamikaze drone,
Right.
which can fly around and poke a hole in the top of a tank, armored personnel carrier, or whatever. So it is a absolute buzzsaw for Ukrainian infantry and armor to try to go through. That's why you hear lots of noise of, well, they've broken through the first layer of defense. Yeah, there's 2 and 3 more layers of defense to do. And even if they did all the way through there, you still need a massive logistics footprint for a unit to push through, to keep moving, because tanks And those kind of combat units are very thirsty in fuel and in ammunition. So it's more akin to a World War I style, very linear battlefield, just chewing up men and equipment. And
On both sides.
On both sides.
Right.
And the Russians did not really put their A-team forward now. The Ukrainians did. And
So the varsity is still on the bench?
there is still some varsity capability yet in Russia. And they've learned, and look, the Russian army has a very high tolerance for pain. Shown again and again in World War I, in World War II, and even, just remember, as late as the late 90s, early 2000s, the Russians lost 15,000 men in Chechnya, fighting inside their own country.
Right.
15,000. How many did we lose in Iraq? 5,000. So they will take casualties and grind along, and they have a very different view on collateral damage. They don't care. And so we are not doing Ukrainian society any favors by giving them this delusion that they're going to take all their line back, let alone Crimea. You hear a lot about trying to take Crimea.
Right. And this is the propaganda arm. This is Zelensky's propaganda arm, is the U.S. government and the U.S. media.
And the U.S. media.
Painting this picture as if Ukraine is getting the advantage at this point. And it's all bull.
It's not. They are separate. Even a lot of the generals, the so-called smart U.S. battlefield commanders, that are thinking about how they fought in a counterinsurgency in Iraq or Afghanistan, is a very different fight versus a mechanized, armored Russian army dug in familiar terrain. Crimea, absolute fool's errand to think you're going to take that by amphibious invasion, because you cannot do amphibious operations unless you control the sea. They do not control the sea. The Ukrainians don't. Two, and you really need to control the air as well, and they do not control the air. If you try to do a land-based assault, there's a tiny little isthmus. It's only about 5 kilometers wide in the north, and you can imagine how much the Russians have layered in defense after defense after defense there. The only possible way to attack Crimea, there's shallows just to the east of it. You could put a waiting kit on some of the Leopard tanks, possibly, but again, it's a fool's errand. It ain't happening. And countries have been fighting over Crimea for centuries.
But that's where the neocons want to push us into the war. Now let's look ahead.
Push us or push NATO allies?
NATO.
No way. There's
Right.
there's no effing way any American should step foot in Ukraine to fight.
Right. But at a minimum, we're still spending hundreds of billions of dollars in this, what could be an endless war. So give me the outlook from here. We've got bad weather coming. Putin has an election in the spring, right? So what does it look like between now and then?
Putin's big mistake was waiting until the Chinese Olympics were done. Because I'm sure Xi asked him to wait until the Winter Olympics were done. So this February of 2022.
Right.
And Putin, if Putin's going to go, he should have gone in December, because he would have had hard frozen fields and he could have moved. The reason he had those long logistics lines of 30 miles of trucks on roads is because the fields, right? What is a great farm field when it's got covered with snow and then it melts? A big mud bog. Mm-hmm. And so the rains come in the fall now. The fields are going to be muddy. So you're not going to see major movements at all until about December, where it's hard frozen. Don't rule out an effective Russian counterpunch, because I'm sure they have plenty of resources. They are getting resources from China for their industry. They are definitely getting resources from North Korea, artillery shells, and all the
proxies
heavy,
on both sides.
The heavy consumables of war. They're getting them, and they have an industrial base yet. And so don't rule out a Russian maneuver warfare element to push back.
And Putin has the incentive to do that in December,
yes,
because he has an election.
He has an election in March. And look, Putin is riding a tiger. He got very bad intel, thinking that he was going to be treated as the liberating, conquering hero by rolling into Ukraine.
Right.
He has hundreds of thousands of dead, hundreds of thousands of wounded, millions of pissed off family members. And so if he comes to that election without saying, rah, rah, we've delivered something great. He could be in trouble in the election. He's locked up. His opponents, both on the free speech side, the Navalny side, and all the super Russian nationalists.
Going to poison them or imprison them.
Yes, or they tend to fall out of windows.
Right.
So he's riding a tiger, and he cannot try to step off that tiger. And so we have to think they're gonna stay in it until at least 2025, until there's a new White House administration.
So let's take it there. Let's exit on this. What has been failed to be done by this White House intentionally is defining an end game. Like, what is the goal? We're spending U.S. tax dollars that should, by the way, be spent on the U.S. southern border. Instead, it's being spent on the Ukraine border. They will not define an end game.
And churning through thousands of Ukrainian men.
Right. And so
weekly.
What is the aspiration of the leftists who are running policy in this administration? What is their aspiration? There's no end game defined intentionally. We still spend money. We're not even using this current appropriations process, right, to hold back on the funds or make it more accountable. What's their aspiration? Do they want us in war with Russia?
They have this delusion that they're going to defeat Vladimir Putin somehow. And in this battle in Ukraine, it's not going to happen.
We're going to come back to this over and over again because obviously we're stuck in a bog in this Russia-Ukraine war. And the U.S. national interest is not properly defined, correct?
Correct. Look, Ukraine surviving as a country, sure, fine, great. But we don't have to enable and spend hundreds of billions of dollars for them to take back every square meter of terrain that they claim. That is not our national interest.
Where the hell are the NATO members? Why aren't they paying for this?
Well, Germany is focused on green transformation, and they even closed, I think, 4 or 5 of their nuclear power plants early to adhere to a green agenda. So
try
again,
19.
I'm 19.
After the tidal wave in
I stand corrected.
Japan.
Yes.
That's all right. I think that I'll check. I think the number is 19. They shut down all of their nuclear power capability, and so that made them
the greenest source of power of all,
the best source of power of all, and which is why they needed Nord Stream 2.
Yep.
Right? Because all of a sudden they can't produce their own energy.
So again, because the globalists running Europe worship the environmental movement more than they care for their own citizens,
so they won't
independence,
step
and
up
freedom
to pay their share, even though their national security is more at risk.
Germany is still not even paying 2% of their GDP into defense spending.
Despicable.
Yeah, 5 out of 28. It's a joke.
Despicable. All right.
Trump is right to be pissed, and Trump was right to call him on it.
Right, and it was working.
Yep.
They were starting to pay more of their fair share. Like a businessman called them out.
Yeah, but a long ways to go.
A long ways to go. All right, we're going to come back in just a minute here because you know what? Communications is fundamental to restoring freedom in America. We're going to tell you why.
Imagine a technology company built to restore your privacy, not take it away. You and your phone are constantly bombarded with tracking, surveillance, propaganda, and digital attacks. Even big tech companies claiming to protect privacy create their own backdoors. Unplugged restores what's been lost, starting with a messenger, a VPN, a mobile antivirus. The Unplugged app bundle gives you back what's rightfully yours. Unplugged. Restore your privacy.
Hey, we're off leash with Erik Prince. I'm Mark Serrano. Thanks for coming back. Erik, you were a great success with Blackwater as the founder. It's one of your, part of your identity now. Publicly, people love the success of Blackwater. A lot of people want to know, what are you up to now?
Well, Mark, after seeing what happened around the 2020 election with big tech canceling certain conservative voices, throwing people off of certain app stores, censoring outright, I said to a couple of friends of mine, someone needs to do an independent phone platform that is not subject to the whims of Google and Apple.
Hell yeah.
So,
and the censorship is just mind-blowing. Government-sponsored censorship that took place. We need a fix to that.
Yes, you have White House turning to law enforcement saying, suppress this speech, law enforcement, FBI going to Google and Apple saying, suppress that, take that off of Twitter, off of Facebook or whatever. That is Soviet level Stasi-like performance.
Right.
And so
how do you fix it?
we wanted a phone that is completely independent of that that protects your privacy, where you own your data, that you can speak securely, and is not subject to the whims of a big government. So we've developed, and it's called Unplugged, the phone. You can now pre-order them. We have 500 delivering in October. The pre-orders will start to deliver in the thousands after that. But the unique thing is it's our hardware. Okay, if you really want to be secure, it's not just a matter of software or an app. You need hardware, an operating system, and secure messaging. And we provide all those things. So our phone, our hardware is comparable in speed, storage, camera quality to what the big guys offer.
Is that it?
This is it. This is one of them. It's not made in China, specifically
Good
a
start.
supply chain not coming from anything CCP controlled. Another unique thing about our phone is it has an actual kill switch, an off switch. So when you shut it off, if you put your iPhone or your other Android type device and you put it in airplane mode or you turn it off, it's still pinging. It's pinging.
Really?
It's pinging towers. It's pinging Wi-Fi, and it still creates a digital breadcrumb trail of everywhere you're going, and it's even listening. Okay, but this phone has an actual off switch, so that off is off. It air gaps the battery from the electronics. Okay, so our operating system is unique in that it doesn't have an advertising ID. Big tech right now, Google and Apple, know where you go. They know who you call, what you buy, what you browse, and they sell that data to the tune of about $180 per year.
They pick up on our conversations and feed us ads based on what they hear.
Yeah,
right? Am I suspicious, or is that true?
Everyone I've ever talked to recounts a time that they were talking about some very unique, rare theme, and then suddenly they're getting advertising on that very topic.
Right. So we're not all paranoid.
Nope, it's real. So
they're doing it one way or another.
Modern cell phones have become basically a listening device to sell advertising, to provide advertising to you. This is the alternative to that. And I really learned it was also necessary when I managed to piss off my wife. And she sent me a scorcher of a text on WhatsApp. And for the next 2 weeks, she was getting nonstop advertising from divorce lawyers and from Match.com. Right? Because WhatsApp monetizes everything you pass through. Every call, every message, every picture, every voice note is analyzed by their algorithm to push advertising to you.
That happened to me too, except my wife was getting messages about how to hire somebody to kidnap your husband. So it's the same difference.
Be careful. Be careful what you wish for, right? So hardware, our operating system, okay, our operating system default protects you from all the hooks that the apps that you may want to use from putting their stuff in. We also have a thing called the Privacy Center, which effectively behaves like a firewall on your phone. So you can have settings as to what things you allow access into your phone and what things you have a hard no shut off.
So basically social media accounts, browsers and such, they're constantly clawing away your data and your information, right?
And we provide the means for your phone to say no.
And as a user of those platforms, whether it's social media, as the user of my phone, when I'm signing off on my contract or the terms of service for using Facebook or whatever, I'm basically agreeing that they can sell my data, right?
You're right. Even when you sign up for the phone use from Google or Apple, their user agreement says, yeah, basically we're harvesting your stuff and are going to resell it. Our operating agreement says we're not collecting, analyzing, any of that.
All right, how about somebody shows up to you with a subpoena looking for the data for a user who owns your phone?
We don't,
because we've seen a lot of that.
Sure.
With Apple
and we are intentionally set up for that because we don't have any of your user data. And if it passes through our server, it's encrypted and we don't have the keys to it because the keys, the encryption keys are generated between your phone and whoever you're communicating with. So we are out of that at all.
So the
They can
FBI
give
is
us a
told
subpoena.
tough luck.
Correct. We even have a dump feature that if someone takes your phone and say, unlock it, and I want to see what it is, you can enter a certain code and it will be wiped.
All right. So a lot of people today are so mistrusting of all the big institutions, the big corporatists, the big corporations.
With
and so
good
forth,
reason.
With good reason. Okay. So tell me, like, who's your marketplace? Who are you gonna target for buying that?
We figured there's 3 buckets of customers. One would be anyone that's in blockchain currency or using any kind of banking app from their phone, because their phone doesn't have an advertising ID and it's very hard to hack. That's one customer user. Second would be the entire free speech crowd, left,
Huge.
right, or center. People that want to have free access to information that they control are a natural user. Because we have our own app store, we can even have apps that have been thrown off of a lot of the other app stores because Silicon Valley didn't deem them politically correct.
That's
like
huge.
even a dating app for people that are not vaccinated. If that's what your groove is,
You allow it.
we allow it.
Apple doesn't.
Silicon Valley does not.
Right. Okay.
Exactly. And third would be any kind of professional, doctor, lawyer, intelligence person, oil field people, anyone that's traveling to weird places that wants to have secure communications and not leave a digital breadcrumb trail of everywhere you go and everyone you interact with. If you value your privacy, Unplugged is for you.
This is huge because look, the people who are panicked about what they saw in the 2020 election and the shutting down of conservative voices.
Yep.
You're not just going to target the conservatives, but they're going to come to this in droves because of their concerns.
You can run it, of course, it needs a SIM, right, to operate to connect to data, but you can even run it off a hotspot, off of Wi-Fi or Starlink or whatever. So there's lots of ways as long as you get data service. It is a portable, secure communications device.
Awesome. Okay, great to hear about this. You're putting your money where your mouth is. That's what I love about this because you're living it.
Yep.
You see the problems with America. You see what's happening with us and the Marxists trying to take over, and our way of life is literally at risk. This is going to fight back on that culture.
Free speech and secure communication are essential for a free people.
Awesome. All right, we're going to talk a lot about Unplugged in the future. Thanks again for joining us. This is Off Leash with Erik Prince. I'm Mark Serrano. Let's catch up with you next time. Thanks a lot.